The right can't be political. There is no political spectrum, only a power spectrum. Article by Kai Matara. After Charlie Kirk was assassinated, many politicians came out condemning the assassination and would say repeatedly, "Political violence is not acceptable in our society." To many, this was baffling, as it was coming from people who have ordered, supplied, and even participated in the killing of innocent civilians in war and genocides. Don't these people participate in political violence constantly? Not really. The right, including liberals, do not participate in political violence, but police violence. Part 1. Our system is a police order. Have you ever wondered why the police function as Department of Corrections or correction officers? Looking through a wider societal lens, such as their crackdowns on protesters such as Palestine Action, we see that their correction has a wider, more damaging definition, even if they don't care to admit it. To understand what I mean, I am going to give you a command I would like you to do. Ready? Hey, two! If you don't understand Maori, you likely didn't follow this command. This example shows that following commands require a level of understanding. It would be impossible for you to know that I asked you to stand up if you didn't understand what I asked of you. Understanding implies a shared capacity for reason or language. The command-obey system, society's hierarchy, only works because the obedient person is already equal in capacity to understand and challenge the command. Now that you know the command A2, you inherently also have the capacity to ignore or even rebel against that command. Seriously, now that you know that I asked you to stand up, I am willing to wager that most of you, in fact, did not stand up. That's where the correction comes in. Because to understand a command you must necessarily understand that you have the capacity to reject and rebel. It becomes paramount for the police order to correct that contradiction. The system corrects people because understanding a command also means you could reject it. To maintain authority, the hierarchy must suppress that capacity to rebel, evidenced by things like crackdowns on protesters. In their article, "Are you really in favor of hierarchy?" Probably not. The Peaceful Revolutionary wrote, "Your boss can't physically drag you to work, but they can fire you and give you a bad reference. The government can't force you to agree with its laws, but it can lock you in a cage if you disobey them. The landlord can't make you pay, but they can evict you and have armed police put you onto the street." As you can see, the police order is not solely the realm of police. It is the internal logic of our current system, the system of capitalism, the state, and of course, police. What we call politics is, in fact, police order. Part 2. What is the right? Edmund Burke, often dubbed the father of conservatism, believed that hierarchy was central to conservatism, seeing it as essential for maintaining the established order. Hierarchy, by its very nature, must necessarily perpetuate and conserve itself, be it capitalism, the state, patriarchy, racism, etc. To do this, the hierarch must ensure everyone has a predefined part or place. To conserve the hierarchy, they must enforce what is normal and who belongs where. E.g., workers work, women are wives and mothers. These people are important. Those people are not. Not to say these groups can do these things, but that they must and must only do these things. If you can work, you must work, i.e. not be on the benefit. Women shouldn't have careers and just be mothers. Immigrants aren't welcome in this country, etc. The hierarchy tries to ensure they must have no part anywhere else. Another example of this is through the racial profiling and police violence against black people, where the state still believes they have a right to control black bodies and relegate them back to their quote-unquote place. A black person in a white neighborhood, for example, is often treated as out of place, as a living contradiction to the hierarchy. This racist function of the police order then leads to the killing of black people for mundane activities: sleeping, walking, driving. Hierarchy must correct, coerce, or punish to maintain itself, as an attempt to keep people away from power, legitimacy, or even life. Because of this logic, authorities, therefore, are agents of alienation. This is why David Graeber called police bureaucrats with batons. This is also why leftists are correct when they say liberals are right-wing. Liberals still uphold the same hierarchies the conservatives do: police, the state, capitalism, etc. They just believe they can do it in a kinder way, using softer, less visibly violent means, though even this is questionable, often relying on soft power such as welfare systems, fair policing, regulation, or social policies, but still maintain existing hierarchies which still reinforces who has authority and who is marginalized. The right, then, are those who uphold hierarchy. Part 3. What is the left? As established at the beginning, the contrast to hierarchy is equality, so naturally the left would be on the side of equality. Equality in this sense isn't about literally making everyone equal, as in formal parity. It's a disruptive principle, a force that challenges the hierarchy itself. To elaborate, remember earlier when I talked about the parts having no part, relegated to specific spheres, under a hierarchy? Take the worker example. When the revolutionary proletariat claims to represent everyone equally, not just workers, think the line from the Internationale. The Internationale unites the human race. It claims universality. But by claiming universality, it ceases to be a normal, stable class, because a stable class is defined by its specific role. When the proletariat acts this way, it is already different from itself. It is both a specific part and a universal force. Because of this, its identity as a class dissolves. It is much like a sugar cube in tea. The more it spreads, the more it dissolves its original shape. It ceases to be confined, both in function and in form. Importantly, it is not enough for the proletariat to rhetorically claim to represent everyone. It must materially do so. The universality of the proletariat only becomes real when production and distribution themselves are organized by universal principles, from each according to ability to each according to need. Side note, this is exactly why intersectionality is so important. So despite people like Judith Collins talking trash about the mega-strike in Aotearoa and claiming the #1 item on their agenda for a meeting with Education Minister Erica Stanford was Palestine, even if it was, as established, that's actually a good thing. Part 4. What is politics? For politics to exist, 3 things must exist: plurality, disagreement, and change. If there were only one person, there would be no need for decision-making between differing wills. Politics would be meaningless because what would there be to negotiate or deliberate about? Therefore, politics presupposes more than one agent, making plurality a necessary condition. For something to be plural, it must allow disagreement. One cannot deliberate with someone else without the possibility of disagreement, and to attempt to remove the opportunity for disagreement instead of addressing it is to no longer have plurality. For disagreement to happen, it must have the opportunity for change and development, because disagreement presupposes that positions, norms, or outcomes can be contested and transformed. Disagreement that can't transform outcomes is performative, not political. Therefore, only the dialectic, the process of struggle and transformative contestation, is genuinely political, and the left, as established earlier, participate in this practice. Everything else, including liberal democracy or conservative administration, is a form of policing, as they uphold hierarchies that hinder true material and social contestation, and in many cases, even plurality itself. This is why they enclosed structures such as Maori democracy, as pointed out here in my most recent article. The right's existence depends on preventing the conditions of politics, plurality, disagreement and change, from flourishing. To protect hierarchy, it must continually close the space of politics. Were it ever to truly open that space, it would dissolve its own reason for being. In short, you politicize something to force it to change. The left's role. You police something to keep it from changing. The right's role. Part 5. A false distinction. Conservatives may try to disagree with this and claim that the state and capitalism are polar opposites. However, this is a false distinction. The state is not external to capitalism, but in fact, one of its internal conditions of existence. This is because the function and relentless drive of individual firms drives them to act in self-destructive ways where each pursues profit and survival by cutting costs and competing ruthlessly. Yet this behavior collectively undermines the very conditions capitalism needs to reproduce itself, such as stable demand or a healthy workforce. No firm has the incentive or capacity to secure these long-term conditions, and this is where the state factors in. Dependent on taxation and accumulation for its own survival, the state simultaneously provides what capital cannot: property rights, legal frameworks, currency stability, education, welfare, infrastructure, and crisis management. It acts as what you might call the ideal collective capitalist, ensuring the system as a whole continues, even when individual firms threaten its collapse. The state manages capitalism's contradictions and guarantees its survival. Without the state, the competitive logic of capital would eventually destroy itself. Without capital, the state would lose its material foundation. Part 6. This logic is also why reformism actually helps capitalism. Once in a blue moon, usually after capitalism's contradictions lead to crisis or even fascism, what Michael Parenti calls capitalism's final solution to the class struggle, capital will concede significant reforms. This actually keeps capitalism alive. Capitalism, because of its relentless need to expand, necessarily requires non-capitalist areas to expand into. It requires regions, communities, or economies not yet governed by the logic of accumulation. Once the entire globe is drawn into capitalist circulation, the system loses its external frontier and faces crisis. It works like this. Capitalists own the means of production. Their goal is always to produce more and make more profit, so they constantly invest in bigger factories and better technology. However, to make a profit, they pay workers wages that are less than the value they create. For example, a worker makes $100 worth of goods, but gets paid $20. The other $80 is profit. This necessarily means the worker cannot buy all, or even most, of the goods they create. So the capitalist must move beyond simply the worker and towards regions or peoples who aren't fully under capitalist wage labor. These could be peasants, artisans, colonies, semi-feudal societies, or, as mentioned, countries with significant socialist reforms. And so capitalists sell their surplus goods there, the ones their own workers can't buy, and extract cheap raw materials or force trade through colonial domination. However, to profit more, one must produce more, and to produce more, one must expand capitalism further. So capitalism spreads, and more regions become capitalist. Peasant land is turned into wage labor, colonies industrialize, artisans are replaced by factories, and in countries with significant socialist reforms, neoliberalism is introduced. Then the contradiction comes back in. The more of the world is capitalist, the fewer external markets exist for surplus goods. Domestic workers still can't buy all the goods because they're underpaid. In other words, you need exploited labor to produce surplus, but that same labor can't fully, or even mostly, consume the surplus. Without external non-capitalist markets, the system's exploitation hits its limit. That's why capitalism even allows reformism in the first place. When things get dire and fascism doesn't fix its contradictions, it never does. It must seek out that non-capitalist market to stop its own contradictions causing its collapse. But to do that, such a market must necessarily exist to expand into. In other words, the proletariat must seek universality to abolish itself, while the bourgeoisie must avoid universality to sustain itself. Part 7. The good news. The system of authority or hierarchy is like a perpetual paradox. It succeeds because people are capable of disobedience, but that very capability is precisely why it must exert endless force to remain in place. Consider the E2 example. Because you inherently have the capability of disobeying my command, it would take me a lot of constant and costly effort to enforce it and make sure everyone stands up when I say. This shows that authority and hierarchy depends on constant enforcement because it's trying to maintain an artificial asymmetry in a world that is, by its very nature, relational and dynamic. Authority and hierarchy are fragile precisely because they are contrary to the dialectic, meaning they are in tension with the natural living movement of human relations. Unlike natural relationships, friendship, family, mutual cooperation, authority is artificial and fragile, existing in tension with the very people it governs. This is why Karis Nemec's words on Andor resonate so much. If something is already costly and brittle, then with enough resistance, it will break. This is why empires fall